Another story about modern day pilgrims I want to read to you today is called My Freedom Trip, A Child's Escape from North Korea by Francis Park and Ginger Park, illustrated by Deborah Reed Jenkins. My Freedom Trip. And this is a true story. Many years ago, when I was a little schoolgirl in Korea, soldiers invaded my country. The soldiers drew a big line that divided Korea into two countries, North Korea and South Korea. In North Korea, we could no longer speak our minds or come and go as we pleased. We lost our freedom. Many of us secretly escaped to South Korea, the Freedom Land. This is my story. A peaceful sun shone upon my village in North Korea, over rice paddies and pagoda roofs, on pink petals in ponds and quartz stones on the ground. I walked home from school down a path where flowering bushes lined the road and a soft breeze carried butterflies. It was a beautiful day. The sky seemed endless and my eyes were soaring. From here, the world looked as free as the doves swiftly dipping into treetops. But one by one, my classmates had been missing from school. First Umi, then Unuk, then Miyuk, my best friends. They had left their homes in the middle of the night to cross the border to the Freedom Land. Now I walked home alone. Then one night my father came to my room and gently woke me. It was so dark that I could not see his face. He spoke softly. Tonight I must go on a trip. A man named Mr. Han will guide me to South Korea. He knows of a secret passage where I will cross the border at the shallow end of a river. Appa, I wailed, do not go. My father stroked my hair. His fingers were trembling. Soon, very soon, Mr. Han will return for you, Sue, and he will take you on your freedom trip. Then it will be your mother's turn. But why can't we go together? I pleaded. Only one of us can go at a time, he tried to explain. Less people means less danger of being captured by soldiers. What was danger? It sounded as deep and dark and cold as a river. My father kissed my cheek, then left my side. He stood in the doorway for a long time. I'll be waiting for you on the other side of the river, he promised. My mother and I awaited word of my father. Every morning we sipped barley tea, wondering where he was. Every evening we played Ute, still wondering. One evening, full of moon and warm winds, we heard a tap, tap, tap. My mother dropped her Ute sticks and rushed to the door. A man in white peasant clothing stood in the doorway. On his back, he carried a big, heavy sack. Behind him, the sky was haunting. As the man stepped inside, I stepped back. He towered over me. Then his face broke into a gentle smile. Do not be afraid, Sue, he spoke. I am Mr. Han, your guide. I bring news of your father. My mother held her heart. Your father is safely settled in the Freedom Land, he told me. He is waiting for you. My mother quietly rejoiced, then began packing my knapsack with jelly candy, fruit, and clothing. Tonight you go on your freedom trip, Sue, she carefully announced. Now quickly, you must change your clothes. Oma, I begged, come with me. She cupped my face and whispered, do not worry. Her breath was as warm and soothing as tea. Mr. Han will return for me, and we will be reunited. My mother hugged me. I could feel her heart beating against mine like a dying dove. Be brave, Sue, she cried. My freedom trip began by train. Mr. Han took my hand. Silently we boarded. The train was crowded with passengers bumping into one another. No one spoke or let their eyes meet. I looked out the window. Farms and villages seemed to speed by me. Already I missed my mother's touch. Already our parting seemed like a lifetime ago. The train came to a stop at the foot of a tall, rocky mountain. Mr. Han secretly nodded. Then we slipped away from the train and into the night. Up the mountain we walked while the cries of wild animals in our ears and the moon in our eyes. The woods were all around us. Every few moments, Mr. Han would stop and listen for footsteps. I would listen too. We were as still as rocks. Then he would wink at me and we would continue up the mountain. All at once, footsteps were upon us. Mr. Han and I crouched in bushes, not breathing. We watched the long shadows of soldiers creep along a row of rocks. Were we in danger? When the shadows disappeared and the footsteps grew distant, Mr. Hahn whispered, "The soldiers can spot our shadows on the ground because the moon is bright tonight." Sorrowfully, he squeezed my hand. "We must hide here, Sue, until the moon has fallen from the sky." Mr. Hahn opened his sack, then he put a blanket around me and began peeling fruit in the moonlight. How I longed for my father, how I wished he could come and carry me across the river to the Freedom Land. How I longed for my mother, how I wished I was back home playing Ute with her. In a gust of wind, her last words came to me. "Be brave, Sue." In the time the moon vanished behind the mountain, all was dark over Korea. Mr. Hahn took my hand. We were like owls, looking everywhere. We walked until daylight touched the mountainside with grass and wildflowers and four-leaf clovers, until the sound of rushing water reached my ears. "I can hear the river," I whispered. Mr. Hahn nodded knowingly. "You are close to freedom, Sue." Suddenly, leaves rustled. We stopped and listened for footsteps. Mr. Hahn's hand trembled in mine. Were we in danger? A soldier leaped into our path. His eyes darkened as he raised his weapon. "Halt!" he demanded. "Turn around and go back to your village." Mr. Hahn pleaded with him. "I will go back, but please let the child go. Her father is waiting for her across the river." "No one is allowed to cross the river," the soldier shouted. "I beg you, let the child go," Mr. Hahn continued to plead. "She's come a long way without sleep." The soldier's attention turned to me. I did not move. I did not speak. The mountain was so quiet I could hear a breeze pass through the trees. It carried my mother's message. "Be brave, Sue." After a long, silent spell, the soldier lowered his weapon. He looked away from me. I heard him whisper, "Go quickly, child." Mr. Hahn guided me toward a dark, mossy opening in the woods. "I must go back, but you are free, Sue. Go, go." I ran without thinking. I was so frightened I forgot where I was going. Then I saw the river. The water was so blue my eyes were swimming in every direction. And there was my father waving wildly from the other side, the Freedom Land. "Sue, Sue," he cried out. "Appa," I cried back. I rushed into the river, embracing the sun and the sky. I was free. Shortly after my freedom trip, soldiers were posted all along the border, and my mother was forced to stay in North Korea. Soon the Korean War broke out. The war was bigger than any mountain and more haunting than any sky. When the fighting ended, my country was still divided. I never saw my mother again. How could we have known that the river I crossed would separate us forever? Many years have passed. I am no longer a little schoolgirl, but I still think about Mr. Hahn, my gentle guide, and about the soldier who set me free. Mostly, I think about my mother. When the evening is full of moon and warm winds, I can still hear her cry, "Be brave, Sue," brave for the rest of my life. The end. It's a pretty sad story, isn't it? She does make it to freedom, though, she and her father. And she grew up and married and had children of her own, and it was her daughters who wrote the book. This is a true story. Sue was a real person.